In the shadows of a storied estate, a single act of cruelty ignites a battle between cherished traditions and the cold call of modern ambition. Every whispered secret and silent tear carries the weight of generations, as loyalty and legacy collide in a struggle that will redefine the meaning of family. Don't forget to subscribe for more riveting tales that peel back the layers of power, pride, and passion. Nicholas Deo's sleek black car glided along the long, gravel driveway of the Deo estate, a sprawling compound that had once been the center of his childhood world. The imposing iron gates, set against a sky streaked with the early hues of dawn, stood as silent sentinels to generations of legacy and tradition. For Nicholas, this return was more than a journey back home. It was a pilgrimage to the very roots of his identity. After years spent forging a new empire beyond the boundaries of his family's ancestral home, Nicholas now arrived as a self-made millionaire, confident yet weighed down by memories. As the car rolled to a stop beneath the ancient oak trees lining the entrance, his mind swirled with reminiscences of simpler days. Afternoons spent playing hide and seek in the maze of corridors, secret whispers and hidden nooks, and the gentle guidance of a woman who had shaped his early years. Stepping out, he inhaled deeply. The air carried both the scent of dew on freshly cut grass and the unmistakable aroma of old wood and polished stone. Among the gathered estate staff, faces worn with time and loyalty greeted him. Their eyes held a mix of reverence and relief. This was the prodigal son returning, and they sensed that beneath his polished exterior still lay the boy who once ran barefoot along these halls. By his side was his wife, Isabel, a vision of contemporary elegance. With her manicured fingers brushing lightly over the leather of the car's interior, she exuded refined taste and ambition. Yet as her gaze swept over the estate, her lips pursed ever so slightly. Where Nicholas saw hallowed tradition, she saw relics of a bygone era. Despite her modern aspirations, she was now compelled to play the role of the perfect socialite in this setting of time-worn grandeur. Before Nicholas could fully absorb the bittersweet reunion with his past, the grand oak doors swung open. Out stepped two formidable figures, his Aunt Marin, with a warm yet commanding presence, and his older brother, James, whose teasing smirk bespoke both welcome and challenge. But it was the sight of Mabel, the childhood nanny, who stirred something deep within him. Despite the passage of time, Mabel retained the dignified grace of someone who had been the quiet backbone of his upbringing. Her dark, time-lined face shone with the wisdom of years spent nurturing, and her calm presence was a living testament to the love that had quietly supported him through every trial. With deliberate, measured steps, Nicholas moved toward Mabel. In a moment that silenced murmurs and softened the formal rigidity of the staff, he enveloped her in a warm, almost desperate embrace. Here was a man, usually composed and calculated, letting his heart speak in a way that no boardroom or empire building could. Mabel's eyes glistened with both pride and a tinge of sadness as she murmured a gentle greeting, her voice a mix of affection and quiet reproach. It was as though she were silently questioning the cost of all his worldly achievements. That brief encounter set the tone for the day, a day marked by contrasting emotions. While Nicholas's heart warmed with childhood memories and gratitude, Isabel's expression remained cool and evaluative. She exchanged a few polite words with Aunt Marin and James, her tone polished but distant. As the family and staff silently observed, a delicate tension took root. The old world of loyalty, tradition, and unspoken promises clashed with a new era defined by modern sensibilities and a relentless quest for perfection. Nicholas, with every step toward the grand entrance, could feel the pull of memories mingling with the weight of responsibility. The estate, a living relic of a proud lineage, was now a stage for an unfolding drama where every gesture, every glance, would reveal truths buried under years of silence. The morning light cast elongated shadows on the stone floors, as if echoing the long-forgotten footsteps of his youth. In that moment, as he surveyed both the familiar and the unfamiliar faces around him, Nicholas knew that this homecoming would not merely be a reunion with the past, but a turning point in the very fabric of his future. Inside the expansive halls of the Deo estate, the air was heavy with both nostalgia and unspoken judgment. The walls, adorned with portraits of stern ancestors and elegant landscapes, whispered secrets of a bygone era, one in which honor and duty were paramount. Nicholas moved through these corridors with a reverence that belied his modern accomplishments, yet the tension between tradition and progress was already evident. Every familiar corner stirred memories of a boy who once roamed these rooms with innocent wonder. Isabel, however, saw the estate through a very different lens. While Nicholas' eyes softened at the sight of the time-worn furniture and intricate tapestries, she regarded them as outdated vestiges of a world that had no place in her vision of luxury. As she glided through the grand foyer, her gaze shifted from the ornate chandeliers to the discreet service doors and the modest quarters where the estate staff lived and worked. To her, the very notion of servants dining together in the family's presence was anachronistic, a detail that marred the perfection of her carefully curated existence. Over a sumptuous breakfast in the formal dining room, the subtle rift between the couple became painfully clear. Nicholas, ever the dutiful son and now a man of wealth, exchanged pleasantries with longtime staff members whose faces, lined with both hardship and loyalty, lit up at his presence. Yet the warm reunion was dampened by Isabel's cool detachment. As she delicately sipped her tea, her eyes flitted over the modest attire of the servants, lingering a fraction longer than necessary. Her internal critique was barely concealed by a polite smile. During the meal, an awkward silence began to spread as Isabel made an offhand remark about the arrangement of the staff quarters. "It's all so quaint," she said, her tone carrying a sharp undercurrent of disapproval. The comment hung in the air like a thin veil of disdain. Nicholas attempted to smile and redirect the conversation, but the damage was already done. His heart ached for the warmth of the past, a time when every member of the household, no matter how humble, was cherished as part of the family's legacy. Aunt Marin, seated at the head of the table, offered a knowing glance at her nephew. Her eyes, wise and weathered by decades of silent vigilance, reflected both concern and disappointment. Across the table, James, ever the provocateur, allowed a small, wry smile to dance on his lips, as though daring Nicholas to challenge the status quo. The tension grew thicker with each passing moment, and as the servants quietly observed from a respectful distance, it became clear that a rift was forming, a fracture between what the estate had always been and what its new occupants desired it to become. In the midst of the discord, Nicholas's thoughts drifted to Mabel. He recalled childhood afternoons when her gentle hands had soothed scraped knees and her reassuring voice had dispelled fears. The memory of her constant, nurturing presence was a balm to his troubled soul. Yet now, as he exchanged pleasantries with the staff, he noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor. There was a softness in her smile that hinted at hurt, a silent acknowledgement that the once unbreakable bond between them was being tested by the cold machinations of modern ambition. After breakfast, while the estate bustled with the day's preparations, Nicholas found a quiet moment in the library, a sanctuary lined with dark wood and filled with the scent of aged paper. He pulled a weathered volume from the shelf, its pages whispering secrets of a past that was both familiar and bittersweet. Outside, the estate's clock chimed softly, marking the passage of time, each note a reminder that change was inevitable. Isabel, meanwhile, wandered the corridors with a critical eye. In her mind, every ancient fixture and every delicate artifact was a relic that needed replacing, a reminder that even the most storied legacies must evolve to remain relevant. Her silent observations were not born of malice, but of a desire to impose a modern order on a world that, in her view, was rapidly falling behind. Thus, on this day, the Deo estate stood divided. On one side was the unyielding embrace of history and loyalty. On the other, a vision of progress that sought to erase imperfections by replacing them with sterile modernity. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow upon the polished floors, Nicholas found himself caught between these two worlds, torn by love for the past and the painful necessity of change. The following morning brought a tentative calm to the estate, as if nature itself hesitated before the brewing storm. Nicholas awoke early in his old bedroom, the soft glow of dawn streaming through lace curtains onto the familiar furniture. He felt a deep connection to these surroundings, a connection forged through countless memories of laughter, lessons, and quiet moments shared with those who had shaped him. Yet, as he prepared for the day ahead, a lingering unease tugged at his heart, a premonition that the delicate balance between past and present was about to shatter. In the grand dining room, as the family gathered for a formal breakfast, a sense of foreboding mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked delicacies. The table was set with fine china and polished silverware, each piece an heirloom of the Deo legacy. As Nicholas took his seat at the head of the table, his eyes scanned the room, taking in the familiar faces of long-serving staff and his own relatives, whose expressions now carried a mixture of respect and concealed tension. Isabel sat gracefully opposite him, yet her gaze was anything but warm. She fixated on the simple uniforms of the household staff, particularly on Mabel, whose dignified presence had always lent a sense of continuity to the estate. As she delicately stirred her tea, her eyes betrayed a critical appraisal, a silent litany of judgments about what she deemed unworthy of the modern life she had envisioned. In a tone that was both casual and caustic, she remarked, "It's curious, isn't it, that even the most essential parts of a home must sometimes look a bit outdated." Her comment, made almost in passing, reverberated around the table. Nicholas felt his pulse quicken as he searched for a response, but before he could speak, a subtle yet significant event unfolded. One of the servers, a young man who had served the Deo family faithfully for decades, accidentally spilled a cup of coffee near Mabel's place setting. The dark liquid seeped across the embroidered tablecloth, staining it in a way that seemed to symbolize the intrusion of modern negligence into a world that cherished tradition. Isabel's reaction was immediate and severe. With a cool detachment, she dismissed the mishap as a minor inconvenience, but added a pointed remark about the need for modern upgrades, as if the incident were evidence that the old order was crumbling. The servants exchanged furtive glances, and Mabel herself only offered a gentle, measured smile, a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. For Nicholas, it was the first unmistakable sign that Isabel's disdain for the familiar was more than a passing fancy. It was a calculated stance against everything he held dear. The conversation at the table faltered, and a thick silence descended. Nicholas tried to lighten the moment with gentle humor, recalling past mishaps that had once elicited laughter instead of judgment, but the words fell flat. The subtle stain on the tablecloth seemed to grow in significance, a visible scar in a home that prided itself on unspoken unity. Even as the family continued with their meal, the underlying tension remained palpable, each bite a reminder of the widening chasm between past loyalties and present ambitions. In the quiet that followed, Nicholas's mind raced. He remembered long afternoons spent by Mabel's side in the kitchen, her warm guidance soothing every scraped knee and every bruised ego. Now, in the glare of modern expectations, that same nurturing spirit was being dismissed as a relic of a simpler time. The juxtaposition of Isabel's modern aspirations against the gentle traditions of his childhood set his heart ablaze with conflicting emotions, a mix of gratitude for the past and anger at its devaluation. After the meal, as the estate resumed its daily rhythms, Nicholas retreated to his father's old study, a sanctuary filled with towering bookshelves, the scent of aged paper, and memories etched in every corner. There, in the quiet solitude, he grappled with the realization that the first blow had been struck, the subtle, yet unmistakable erosion of the cherished bonds that had long defined his home. In that moment, as light and shadow danced upon the ancient walls, he vowed that no matter how modern the demands of the present, the soul of the estate, and of his own heart, would never be allowed to fade into obscurity. Later that day, with the weight of the morning's discord still heavy on his shoulders, Nicholas found refuge in the study's quiet embrace. Surrounded by the familiar scent of leather-bound books and the muted echoes of his childhood, he attempted to reconcile the conflicting emotions churning inside him. His thoughts wandered inevitably back to the incident at breakfast, the careless spill, Isabel's barbed comment, and the silent, stoic dignity of Mabel, who bore the affront without complaint. Every detail stung, a reminder of the widening gap between the comforting traditions of his past and the stark modernity that threatened to usurp them. It wasn't long before the sound of measured footsteps broke his solitude. James, his older brother, entered the room with an expression that was part amusement and part admonishment. Leaning casually against the doorway, James's eyes glittered with a mix of playful teasing and genuine concern. "Nicholas," he began, his voice light, but edged with a seriousness that belied the casual tone, "I always knew you cared too much about keeping the peace. But tell me, does it really feel peaceful to you right now?" Nicholas looked up, his gaze steady yet troubled. The question struck a chord deep within him. He had spent years building an empire, meticulously constructing a world where every detail was controlled and every emotion measured. Yet here, within these hallowed walls that had nurtured him as a child, the familiar sense of peace was now replaced by a disquiet that threatened to unravel everything he had built. James stepped further into the study, crossing the space between them as if to bridge the emotional chasm that had grown between their differing perspectives. "Our family's legacy isn't just about wealth or modernity," he said, his voice quiet but insistent. "It's about the people who built us up, the ones who have always been here even when the rest of the world changed. Mabel is one of those people, and if you let her be treated as nothing more than an inconvenience, then you're losing a part of yourself." The words hung in the air like a solemn promise. Nicholas felt a pang of guilt and regret as he recalled all the moments when he had turned a blind eye to the subtle cruelties that now defined his domestic life. He had allowed the modern world, with its cold efficiency and unyielding demands for perfection, to seep into the heart of his childhood home. In doing so, he had begun to forsake the traditions that had once been his sanctuary. James's tone softened, his eyes filled with the understanding of a man who had seen too much change too soon. "I'm not saying you have to fight every battle," he continued, "but sometimes silence can be more damaging than a single harsh word. Mabel has never complained. She never raised her voice. But that doesn't mean she isn't hurting. And if you continue to let these small wounds go unacknowledged, I fear that one day they'll fester into something you might regret." Nicholas absorbed every word, feeling the weight of responsibility settle even more firmly upon his shoulders. The study, with its quiet reverence for the past, became a confessional space where he could no longer deny the truth, that his inaction, his desire to preserve harmony at any cost, was slowly eroding the very foundation of his family's legacy. James's warning was not a rebuke, but a call to awaken, a plea for him to take a stand for the values that had once defined their shared history. In that quiet moment, as the morning light filtered through the tall windows, Nicholas made an unspoken vow. He would no longer allow the voices of the past to be silenced by the modern demands of power and prestige. His brother's words resonated deeply. To neglect the suffering of those who had nurtured him was to risk losing himself entirely. And so, with a heavy heart and a determined spirit, Nicholas resolved to confront the growing darkness that threatened to divide not only the estate, but his very soul. As the day unfolded into a series of meticulously orchestrated events, the atmosphere at the Deo estate grew increasingly fraught with a silent, simmering tension. The elegant corridors, the well-appointed drawing rooms, and even the gardens, once a source of serene pleasure, now seemed to echo with unspoken grievances and unresolved conflicts. Nicholas found himself caught in the middle of an internal war, one that pitted the cherished traditions of his childhood against the cold, modern aspirations embodied by Isabel. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner in the grand dining hall, the tension was palpable. The long table was set with pristine silverware and gleaming porcelain, every detail arranged to project the perfect image of a bygone era refined by modern sensibilities. Yet beneath the polished surface, subtle discord lurked. The soft hum of conversation did little to mask the underlying disquiet. Isabel, seated near the center, seemed more a spectator than a participant in the family ritual. Her gaze, cool and assessing, drifted frequently toward the servants, particularly toward Mabel, whose calm dignity in the face of criticism had long been a silent testament to her inner strength. With every deliberate movement, Isabel's eyes communicated a disdain for the traditional order, a clear indication that she believed the estate's long-held practices were outdated and in need of a complete overhaul. Throughout dinner, small, deliberate remarks punctuated the polite conversation. Isabel casually mentioned that the staff quarters were too close to the main wing, insinuating that such proximity was unbecoming of a modern household. Her words, though softly spoken, carried the weight of deliberate judgment. In response, Nicholas attempted to steer the conversation back to safer topics, recalling cherished memories of childhood laughter and the enduring support of those who had cared for him. Yet his efforts were met with half-smiles and curt nods that only deepened the silence between him and his wife. As the meal progressed, the clash between tradition and modernity became increasingly evident. Aunt Marin, always the quiet pillar of strength, maintained a dignified silence as she observed the unfolding drama. Even James, who usually embraced mischief with a twinkle in his eye, found himself unusually subdued. The family's unified facade was cracking, revealing the raw emotions that lay hidden beneath years of unquestioning loyalty. After dinner, the corridors of the estate seemed to pulse with the residue of the day's tensions. In the quiet aftermath of the meal, Nicholas wandered the halls, each step echoing like a somber heartbeat in a once familiar home. His thoughts kept returning to Mabel, the woman who had been a constant, nurturing presence through all his formative years. He recalled the countless afternoons spent under her gentle supervision, where every smile, every kind word, was a lesson in compassion and humility. In a small, secluded corner of the estate, near a window that overlooked the moonlit gardens, Nicholas found Mabel quietly arranging a vase of fresh flowers. The delicate fragrance of roses mingled with the night air, creating a brief, ephemeral moment of beauty amid the prevailing gloom. He approached her slowly, hesitant to disturb the fragile peace that she seemed to command. "Mabel," he began softly, "I'm sorry for everything." His voice, laden with regret and uncertainty, trembled as it met her calm, knowing gaze. Mabel's response was measured and gentle. "Nicholas," she said, her tone as soft as the night breeze, "I know you have your reasons. But sometimes silence is a choice that can either protect or hurt." Her words were not an accusation, but a reminder that the quiet acceptance of injustice could, in time, become a wound too deep to heal. In that hushed moment, the true nature of the silent war became clear. It was a conflict fought not with shouts or dramatic gestures, but with every subtle look, every carefully measured word. The battle was for the soul of the estate, and by extension, for the very identity of Nicholas himself. The stakes were no longer simply about maintaining appearances or modernizing an old home. They were about preserving the values and memories that had shaped him from his earliest days. As the night deepened and the estate settled into a restless quiet, Nicholas felt the heavy burden of choice pressing upon him. He could no longer remain a passive observer in a conflict that threatened to unravel the tapestry of his past. The silent war was not merely an internal struggle between tradition and modernity. It was a defining moment in which every silent concession would echo in the days to come. And as he looked into Mabel's steady eyes, he realized that the time for quiet resignation had passed. A storm was coming, and with it, the need to fight for the heart of what truly mattered. The following morning, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Nicholas found himself wandering through the estate's sprawling gardens. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew-dappled roses and ancient ivy that clung to the stone walls of the manor. Every step he took was a journey back through memories of childhood play and quiet moments of solace shared with the one person who had nurtured him without fail, Mabel. Today, however, the garden was not just a refuge for memories, but a silent battleground where unspoken words and suppressed emotions lingered like shadows. Mabel was already tending to a row of blooming lilies near the garden's edge. Her movements were deliberate and graceful, as if each gesture was a carefully choreographed act of dignity. Nicholas approached her slowly, unsure how to breach the gulf that had widened between them in recent days. "Good morning, Mabel," he said softly, his voice barely disturbing the tranquil morning air. She paused for a moment, turning her weathered face toward him. There was a quiet strength in her eyes, a resilience honed by years of silent sacrifice and unspoken sorrow. "Good morning, Nicholas," she replied, her tone even and measured. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of early birds heralding a new day. In that silence lay a conversation more powerful than any words, a conversation that spoke of loyalty, of pain, and of the unyielding bonds that tethered them to the past. As they walked together along a winding path bordered by ancient oaks, Nicholas found himself searching for the right words. The memory of the previous day's discord, Isabel's icy remarks, and the hurt that flashed briefly in Mabel's eyes, haunted him. "I've been thinking," he began hesitantly, "about everything that's happened. I'm sorry, Mabel. I should have done something sooner. I never meant for you to be hurt." His voice wavered under the weight of his confession. Mabel stopped walking and looked at him intently, her gaze unwavering. "You have always done what you thought was best, Nicholas," she said gently, her tone both reassuring and sorrowful. "But sometimes the quiet can be more damaging than an outburst. You saw what happened at breakfast, the way words can bruise even the strongest hearts." Her eyes flickered with an emotion that was hard to name. Was it sadness, resignation, or a blend of both? In that moment, Nicholas understood that her silence over the years was not acceptance, but a shield, a way to bear the burden of a changing world that seemed to care little for the traditions and values that had once defined the Deo family. "I know," he admitted, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I was too afraid to upset the balance, too afraid of the consequences. But every moment I stayed silent, I betrayed a part of who I am, of who I was raised to be." Mabel's eyes softened as she reached out to gently clasp his hand. "You have always been a good boy, Nicholas," she murmured, her voice a blend of tenderness and reproach. "But sometimes even good boys must learn that inaction can be as harmful as a harsh word. You cannot let the world change you so much that you forget where you came from." Her words, though few, struck him with the force of truth, echoing through the depths of his soul. For a long time, they walked side by side, the silence between them now imbued with understanding rather than sorrow. Nicholas found himself silently vowing that he would no longer be complicit in allowing cruelty, whether intentional or not, to erode the very foundations of his heritage. He would stand up for the people who had nurtured him, for the traditions that had given him strength, and for Mabel, whose unspoken words carried the weight of generations. As the morning progressed, the garden blossomed around them, each flower and leaf a symbol of renewal and resilience. Nicholas realized that change was inevitable, but the soul of his home, the love, loyalty, and honor instilled in him by Mabel, could never be lost if he fought to preserve it. In that serene moment beneath the awakening sky, the silent words between them became a promise that he would no longer allow modern ambition to silence the voice of tradition, and that every day henceforth would be a testament to the enduring spirit of family and the quiet strength that had always guided him. That evening, the grand ballroom of the Deo estate shimmered with an air of anticipation as the family prepared to host a formal gathering. The occasion was meant to serve as a grand introduction for Isabel to the extended Deo family and influential guests, a celebration of heritage, legacy, and the promise of a bright future. The ballroom, resplendent with ornate chandeliers, intricate tapestries, and polished marble floors, buzzed with quiet excitement as guests in shimmering gowns and tailored suits arrived one by one. Yet beneath the glittering surface of this elegant affair, a storm of suppressed emotions churned silently. Nicholas moved among the guests with a practiced grace, greeting each person with a polite smile and a nod of acknowledgement. His demeanor was composed, but inside, he struggled with the turmoil that had been steadily building over recent days. As he navigated the crowd, his eyes continually sought out the familiar, gentle presence of Mabel. He found her near the periphery of the room, dressed in a modest uniform that contrasted starkly with the opulence around her. Despite the formal setting, her quiet dignity remained unruffled, a beacon of calm amid the evening's superficial gaiety. Isabel, on the other hand, was in her element. Surrounded by a circle of admirers, she exuded an air of modern sophistication that demanded attention. But as conversations meandered and laughter echoed through the grand space, her eyes repeatedly flicked toward the staff and, most notably, toward Mabel. In hushed tones, a few of the guests remarked on the apparent incongruity of a nanny in uniform gracing such a prestigious gathering. One particularly pointed comment, made by a well-known socialite with a condescending laugh, drew a ripple of laughter from the assembled company. "I see you mean the old maid," the guest teased, his words laced with mockery. Isabel's eyes flashed momentarily, a silent signal that she approved of the sentiment. For Nicholas, that moment was a turning point. As the remark hung in the air, he witnessed a fleeting but unmistakable change in Mabel's expression. Her normally composed features tightened ever so slightly, and the graceful way she held the serving tray in her hands faltered for a split second. In that instant, the full weight of the humiliation she had endured was laid bare before him. The room, with all its polished surfaces and glittering light, suddenly felt unbearably cold and distant. Unable to bear the injustice any longer, Nicholas made his way toward the group. His voice, normally measured and calm, took on an edge of controlled fury as he addressed the assembly. "That remark was uncalled for," he said firmly, his eyes locked on the socialite. The murmurs of discontent that followed were quickly stifled by the collective realization that the golden veneer of the evening was cracking under the strain of unspoken resentments. Yet even as Nicholas defended Mabel in a brief, impassioned speech that echoed through the marble halls, Isabel's eyes bore into him with a mixture of anger and cold calculation. It was as if she reveled in the spectacle, her own sense of superiority bolstered by the public display of loyalty she felt entitled to dictate. The tension that had long simmered beneath the surface now erupted in a torrent of conflicting emotions, public humiliation for Mabel and a silent, seething conflict between husband and wife. As the evening wore on, the guests resumed their polite chatter, but a palpable shift had occurred. The air in the ballroom was thick with the residue of unspoken truths, and every whispered conversation, every furtive glance, served as a reminder that the family's inner sanctum was fracturing. Nicholas, though outwardly composed, was tormented by the sight of Mabel's wounded pride and the realization that the foundation of his home was being undermined by cruelty masquerading as modern refinement. Later that night, as the final notes of the orchestra faded into the soft clinking of glasses and hushed farewells, Nicholas stood alone by a large window overlooking the estate's moonlit gardens. His heart pounded with a mixture of anger, regret, and determination. The humiliation inflicted upon Mabel was more than just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper, more corrosive divide within his own household. And as the cool night air whispered through the open window, Nicholas silently vowed that this injustice would not go unanswered. In the quiet aftermath of the formal gathering, the Deo estate was shrouded in a heavy silence that seemed to press down on every room and corridor. The once inviting halls now felt oppressive, laden with unspoken grievances and unresolved conflicts. Nicholas retreated to the study, where the fading echoes of the evening's events played over and over in his mind like a relentless refrain. The public humiliation of Mabel had fractured something deep within him, an inner strength and resolve that had always been there but had been subdued by years of carefully measured silence. That night, as the estate settled into an uneasy slumber, Nicholas's dreams were haunted by images of Mabel's pained eyes and the cruel laughter that had punctuated the formal affair. He awoke in the early hours, drenched in sweat and clinging to the shards of a nightmare that felt all too real. The bitter taste of regret and shame mingled with a growing anger, a determination that if he did not act, the damage to his family's legacy would become irreparable. Unable to remain idle any longer, Nicholas resolved to confront the mounting crisis head-on. In the dim light of the study, he replayed the events of the day. Isabel's cold approval of the cruel remark, James's silent yet piercing admonishments, and most of all, the look of quiet despair on Mabel's face as she went about her duties. Every detail seared into his memory fueled a growing resolve that this state of affairs could no longer be tolerated. Before the break of dawn, Nicholas made his way to the dining hall, where the remnants of the formal dinner still lingered in the air, a lingering mix of perfume, stale wine, and bitter tension. The long table, once a symbol of unity, now stood as a stark reminder of the fractures within his household. As he took his seat at the head of the table, he was acutely aware of the silent eyes fixed upon him, eyes that carried hope, disappointment, and a longing for resolution. It was during this tense morning meal that Nicholas finally broke his silence. With a voice that trembled with both anger and sorrow, he addressed the gathered family and staff. "Enough," he said firmly, his words echoing in the stillness of the room. "I can no longer stand by while the very soul of this estate is attacked, not just in words, but in the hearts of those who have served us for generations." His eyes, dark with resolve, scanned the faces before him. "Mabel has been more than just a caretaker. She is a part of our family's legacy. To disregard her dignity is to disregard everything that makes this home truly ours." The weight of his declaration hung heavy in the room. Isabel's face, previously a mask of icy indifference, twisted with a mixture of indignation and disbelief. James and Aunt Maren exchanged glances, one pair filled with concern, the other with a resigned acceptance of the inevitable confrontation. In that fraught moment, the divisions within the Deo estate were laid bare, and the silent war that had been waged for so long erupted into an open confrontation. Nicholas continued, his voice rising with the passion of a man reclaiming his heritage. I cannot and will not allow cruelty, whether veiled in modernity or hidden behind a veneer of progress, to tear apart the bonds that have defined our family for generations. Today, I choose to stand up for what is right, for the values that shaped me, and for the people who have always been the heart of this estate. His words, laden with raw emotion, resonated with everyone present. The very air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of his conviction. For a long, agonizing moment, silence reigned once again. Then, as if in a fragile truce, a murmur of agreement rose from a few corners of the table. James, ever the observant older brother, allowed a small nod of approval, and Aunt Marin's eyes softened with a glimmer of pride. Even the staff, whose lives had been interwoven with the legacy of the Deo family for decades, looked on with quiet relief, as though their unspoken suffering had finally found a voice. Yet for Isabel, the declaration was a bitter betrayal, a repudiation of the modern order she so cherished. Her eyes flashed with fury, but the words failed to come. The breaking point had been reached, and there was no turning back. In that charged atmosphere, Nicholas realized that his path was now set. He would either fight for the soul of the estate or lose everything he held dear. As the morning gave way to a new day, the silent war had transformed into a battle of wills, a conflict that would determine not only the future of the Deo family, but also the legacy that would endure for generations to come. The dawn that followed was bright, yet marked by an unyielding tension that pervaded every corner of the Deo estate. In the cool, early light of the breakfast room, as servants busied themselves with the day's chores and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the lingering scent of last night's turmoil, Nicholas prepared himself for the reckoning that was inevitable. The family gathered for breakfast with an air of subdued formality, their faces etched with the strain of recent events. Yet for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Nicholas knew that the time for half measures was over. Taking his seat at the head of the table, he addressed the assembly in a firm, unwavering voice. Today, I have decided that certain things cannot be changed. Every word resonated with an authority that silenced murmurs before they could arise. Our home is built on legacy, on loyalty, honor, and the values that have been passed down through generations. I refuse to allow modern indifference or misguided ambition to rewrite our history. His gaze swept across the room, resting on each family member and servant alike, as if to imprint the truth of his conviction into their very souls. The room fell silent as Nicholas continued. Mabel is not merely a servant. She is the heart and soul of this estate. She has nurtured me, guided me, and given me the strength to stand tall even in the face of adversity. To threaten her dignity is to threaten the very foundation of who we are. His words were deliberate and measured, carrying the weight of a man who had long delayed the moment of reckoning. The declaration, though simple, struck with the force of a revelation. Isabel's eyes, usually so composed, narrowed in a mixture of disbelief and indignation. Her carefully constructed facade began to crack as the realization set in that Nicholas was no longer willing to abide by the established order. Aunt Marin, seated near the center of the table, nodded in quiet approval. Her gentle smile, though tinged with sadness, spoke of relief that the long-ignored grievances were finally being addressed. James, whose earlier mirth had given way to a more contemplative silence, regarded his younger brother with a mixture of respect and sorrow. He understood all too well the cost of standing up for what was right, and he knew that Nicholas would face consequences far beyond a simple family disagreement. Isabel attempted to interject, her voice tinged with a desperate need to reclaim control. "Nicholas, this isn't the time," she began, but he cut her off with a steely glare. "No, Isabel," he replied softly yet firmly. "This is exactly the time. We cannot continue to live in a house where loyalty is measured by convenience and kindness is compromised for the sake of modernity." The statement left little room for negotiation. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement that everything had changed. In that defining moment, the lines were drawn. Nicholas announced, with a calm finality that brooked no dissent, that the staff quarters would remain exactly as they were, integral parts of a home built on mutual respect and shared history. His decision, though simple in its articulation, was a radical departure from the progressive changes Isabel had envisioned. The effect was immediate. Whispers of admiration spread among the loyal staff, while a chill settled over those who had embraced the new order without question. For Isabel, the reckoning was a personal blow, a shattering of her carefully crafted vision of perfection. Her eyes flashed with hurt and anger, but she remained silent. The damage was done, and in that silence, the truth was clear. Nicholas had chosen loyalty over ambition, tradition over modernity, and family over a shallow facade of progress. The breakfast ended quietly, with each member of the household absorbing the gravity of the moment. As the family dispersed, Nicholas lingered at the table, his heart pounding with both relief and trepidation. He knew that the path he had chosen would not be without conflict, but it was a path that honored his past and upheld the dignity of those who had shaped him. With the first light of day reflecting off the polished silverware, Nicholas felt a bittersweet resolve settle within him, a resolve that promised a future where the soul of the Deo estate would remain intact, come what may. In the days that followed the public reckoning, tensions simmered like coals waiting to ignite. The Deo estate, once a sanctuary of warmth and tradition, now seemed a battleground of conflicting ideals. Isabel, her pride wounded and her ambitions thwarted, retreated into herself, channeling her fury into one final, calculated maneuver. Determined to reclaim control and restore what she perceived as a modern order, she resolved to make one last move, one that would forever alter the delicate balance of power within the household. One crisp evening, as twilight settled over the estate and the soft glow of chandeliers illuminated the opulent drawing room, Isabel summoned Mabel to a private parlor. The space was intimate yet imposing, a room decorated with dark, rich fabrics and ornate furniture that spoke of a time when every detail was meticulously curated. Isabel's tone was polite, her smile practiced, as she gestured for Mabel to sit. But behind the veneer of cordiality lay a sting of malice carefully masked by elegance. "Tell me, Mabel," Isabel began, her voice smooth but laced with a biting undertone. "Have you ever considered that sometimes change is necessary for progress?" The question, posed with deliberate precision, hung in the air like a challenge. Mabel's eyes, calm and unyielding despite the subtle tremor of hurt, met Isabel's gaze without flinching. "Change is a part of life, madam," she replied softly. "But there is a difference between progress and losing one's identity." Isabel's smile faltered for an instant, replaced by an unreadable expression as she continued. "I merely suggest that certain traditions may no longer serve the best interests of our family," she said, carefully choosing her words to imply that loyalty to the past could be an obstacle to a brighter, more modern future. Every phrase was laden with condescension, each word designed to belittle the quiet strength that Mabel had long embodied. As the conversation unfolded, a subtle battle of wills ensued. Mabel maintained her dignified composure, responding in measured tones that carried the weight of experience and heartfelt conviction. "I have always believed," she said, "that true progress is achieved not by discarding our past, but by honoring it while embracing the future." Her words, though softly spoken, resonated with an authority that was impossible to ignore. Isabel's eyes flickered with a mixture of indignation and reluctant respect, an acknowledgement, however fleeting, that the values she sought to replace were deeply rooted in the very soul of the estate. Meanwhile, in another part of the house, Nicholas had sensed that something was amiss. The strained silence and the hushed voices of servants had alerted him to a disturbance. Unable to ignore the situation any longer, he made his way to the parlor just as the conversation between Isabel and Mabel reached its critical juncture. He paused in the doorway, silently observing the exchange, his heart pounding with both anger and sorrow. Isabel, noticing his presence, quickly attempted to regain control of the situation. "Nicholas," she said coolly, "I was just ensuring that every aspect of this home reflects the excellence we expect." Her voice dripped with a forced sweetness that did little to mask the underlying bitterness. Nicholas's gaze hardened as he stepped forward. "Excellence is not achieved by denigrating those who have given you everything," he replied, his tone steady but charged with emotion. For a moment, The parlor fell silent. Mabel's eyes shifted between the two figures, her gentle expression now a mixture of sadness and quiet defiance. The tension was palpable, as if the very walls of the room were straining under the weight of the unspoken truths. Isabel's final move, intended to assert her modern authority, had instead exposed the raw, vulnerable heart of a family legacy that would not be so easily rewritten. Unable to muster any further argument, Isabel's features contorted briefly with a mixture of anger and resignation before she withdrew, leaving the parlor and the estate to the silent, enduring strength of tradition. Nicholas, though his heart ached with the cost of this confrontation, knew that the battle for the soul of the estate had reached a pivotal moment. As he watched Isabel retreat, he silently vowed that no further indignities would be tolerated. Later that night, as the estate's grand corridors were shrouded in darkness and only the soft glow of lamplight provided solace, Nicholas and Isabel found themselves alone in their private study. The room, usually a sanctuary of calm and order, had become the stage for a confrontation that neither could avoid any longer. The air was thick with the residue of the day's events, a mix of unspoken grievances, simmering anger, and the weight of an impending reckoning. Nicholas sat at the large oak desk that had belonged to his father, the familiar what a reminder of all that was sacred about the Deo legacy. Across from him, Isabel stood with her arms folded tightly, her face a study in conflicting emotions, pride, regret, and a trace of vulnerability that she fought so hard to conceal. For a long, heavy moment, neither spoke, as if each second stretched into an eternity where the past and present converged. Finally, Nicholas broke the silence, his voice low and steady. "I can't do this anymore," he declared, his words laden with sorrow and resolve. "I can't stand by while you continue to treat Mabel and everything she represents as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience." His eyes, dark with unshed tears and unwavering determination, locked onto hers. "It's not just about tonight or yesterday. It's about everything. It's about the way you look at people, the way you dismiss what matters most in this family." Isabel's eyes flashed with indignation before softening into something akin to regret. "Nicholas, you're overreacting," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to maintain her composure. She began, but Nicholas raised his hand, silencing her gentle protest. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not talking about a single incident. I'm talking about the pattern, this endless cycle of dismissing the very people who have built this legacy, who have nurtured you from the very beginning." The tension in the room was suffocating, every word, every pause laden with the pain of years spent ignoring the truth. "Mabel is more than a servant," Nicholas continued, his voice rising with controlled fervor. "She's family. She's the embodiment of everything that has kept this house warm and alive. I cannot, in good conscience, continue to live with someone who would treat her as disposable, as someone to be humiliated at every turn." Isabel's features hardened. "And what are you saying, Nicholas?" she demanded, her tone sharp yet tinged with desperation. "That you would choose her over me? That you would reject everything we've built together?" Her words, though harsh, carried an undercurrent of fear, a fear of losing control, of losing the modern order she so desperately believed in. Nicholas's eyes softened for a brief moment, revealing the heartache behind his firm resolve. "I'm saying that I can't be complicit in a system that devalues loyalty, that turns a blind eye to cruelty," he said quietly. "I have given you my love and my support, but I cannot stand by and watch the people who raised me be treated as if they were nothing." His voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the weight of a painful realization that had been building for far too long. For what felt like an eternity, the only sound in the room was the steady tick of the antique clock on the wall. Finally, Isabel's expression shifted, a mix of resignation and bitter acceptance creeping into her eyes. "So, what do you want me to do?" she asked softly, the words heavy with implication. Nicholas leaned forward, his gaze intense and unyielding. "I want you to choose," he said simply. "I want you to decide whether you are willing to stand with me, to honor the legacy of this family, or if you're content with tearing it apart piece by piece. I can't allow you to continue this behavior. Either you respect the people who have been here long before us, or you leave." His words were not a threat but an ultimatum, a final, uncompromising stand for the values that had sustained him all his life. The silence that followed was absolute. Isabel's eyes filled with tears that she refused to shed openly. In that charged moment, it became clear that the decision would alter the course of their future irrevocably. After what seemed like an eternity, she whispered, I need time." But Nicholas's gaze was unrelenting. "Time is running out, Isabel. The legacy of this home, the dignity of those who built it, demands an answer. With the ultimatum hanging in the charged air, the study fell into a profound, suffocating silence, one that heralded the final reckoning between two worlds, one rooted in tradition and love, and the other in cold modern ambition. A week later, the heavy silence that had shrouded the Deo estate seemed to lift ever so slightly, replaced by a tentative promise of renewal. The early morning light, soft and golden, filtered through the tall windows, casting long, forgiving shadows on the familiar floors. It was in these quiet hours that Nicholas stepped onto the veranda, his heart both heavy and resolute. The air was crisp with the promise of change, and as he gazed out over the sprawling estate, he felt the stirring of something long dormant, a determination to restore the soul of his home and mend the fractures that had threatened to tear it apart. The moment was bittersweet. Isabel was gone. Without the final ultimatum satisfied by her departure, her absence was a stark testament to the choices made that night. Though the void she left behind was painful, Nicholas recognized that the estate, and his own heart, had been in desperate need of healing. With every step he took, memories of a simpler, more compassionate time came rushing back. Afternoons spent under the watchful eyes of Mabel, the gentle laughter echoing through the halls, and the quiet assurance that the legacy of the Deo family was built on love, respect, and loyalty. Later that day, as Nicholas made his way to the modest cottage on the outskirts of the estate, a sanctuary that had once belonged to Mabel and symbolized the true spirit of home, he paused to take in the sight of the small, overgrown garden now meticulously tended to by devoted hands. It was here, among the whispering trees and soft, verdant growth, that he found Mabel waiting. Her presence, as graceful and resolute as ever, was a balm to his weary soul. Without a word, Mabel extended her hand in welcome, the quiet strength in her eyes saying all that needed to be said. "Welcome home, Nicholas," she murmured, her voice carrying the weight of years and the warmth of unconditional love. And in that moment, as he took her hand, Nicholas felt the heavy burdens of the past begin to lift. The oppressive tension of recent days gave way to the promise of a new beginning, one where the legacy of the Deo estate would be safeguarded by the values that had defined it for generations. Over the course of the day, as the estate slowly came back to life, the staff worked with renewed purpose, their movements imbued with hope and solidarity. The old corridors, once echoing with the whispers of discontent, now resonated with a quiet determination to rebuild and restore what had nearly been lost. Nicholas and Mabel walked together through the familiar rooms, pausing at each cherished spot, a worn armchair here, a faded family portrait there, reaffirming the bonds that had held them together even in the darkest of times. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to twinkle in the twilight, Nicholas gathered with the loyal members of the Deo household in the once again warm dining room. There was no fanfare, no grand declarations, only a shared understanding that they were embarking on a new chapter. Nicholas spoke softly but with an undeniable conviction. "We have been through a storm, and though we lost much along the way, we have not lost who we are. Our home, our family, is built on the foundation of love, loyalty, and respect. Today, we start anew." As the final words faded into the gentle hum of a renewed household, a sense of calm settled over the Deo estate. The scars of the past would remain as reminders of hard lessons learned, but they would no longer define the future. In that quiet moment of reconciliation, Nicholas realized that family was not defined by modern ambition or material wealth. It was defined by the enduring spirit of those who had nurtured him, by the love that had been woven into the very fabric of this home. And so, with Mabel by his side and the legacy of the Deo estate shining brighter than ever, Nicholas stepped forward into a future where every day was a tribute to the past, a celebration of the present, and a promise for a tomorrow filled with hope, dignity, and the quiet power of tradition. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more captivating tales. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned for more exciting stories coming soon.